Right. Good morning and welcome. Today we are going to be going through our second of 6 lectures for the skeletal system, and today is going to focus on long bones and microscopic bone, really diving into the anatomy of a bone, looking at compact versus spongy bone, and figuring out what's going on inside of a bone. Now, to start, we're going to start with generally what is a long bone. And so long bones are just any bone that is longer than they are wide, right? As we talked about last class. Big role for these guys is going to be about supporting our body weight. That's why we're going to find them primarily in our appendages, so in that appendicular skeleton, as well as being a point of attachment for muscles. And there's going to be attachment sites for bone on bone, right? When we look at something like the humerus here, you can see that there will be like a circular kind of head that allows for the bone to slot into another bone. So that's kind of our overview of the bone in general, but we're going to look at the actual parts of the bone now. So we start with the diaphysis. In terms of the bone, right, we have this like long part in the middle here, right? There's two ends, 1, 2, but then this middle section is what we call the diaphysis. It's just called like the central shaft of the bone. It's where most of the support is going to come in, as well as where we're going to find this like cavity, basically this caved out area where you're going to have a lot of your fat, called the medullary cavity. And so diaphysis is the long part of the bone, not including these two heads. That leads to the next section, which is called the epiphysis. So that is the heads of the bone, right? We always have a proximal head, so the point that's like closest to attachment, distal head, right, further away from the point of attachment, and the epiphysis is just those heads. Rounded ends, and this is where we're going to see more spongy bone, as well as our red bone marrow. So diaphysis is where we're going to find that yellow bone marrow. Epiphysis is where we're going to find that red bone marrow. Then inside of the diaphysis, that's where we're going to find that medullary cavity, basically a hollowed out section of the bone. This is where that yellow bone marrow is going to come in, as well as inside of this is where we're going to see a lot of spongy bone, right? It's not going to be like an entire kind of channel. There will still be a little bit of bone inside of that medullary cavity. Now, on the bone, what we'll find is around where the diaphysis, right, the long part, meets the epiphysis, the heads, we are going to see what is called the epiphyseal plate. You guys have probably heard about the epiphyseal plate before, but as the growth plate, and this is where we're actually going to see our bone grow from, right? The bones can't really grow from the top because the top is designed, or the heads are designed to slot into another bone, and so you tend to see not a ton of growth in the actual heads of the bone, but rather in where the head, right, the epiphysis, meets up with the diaphysis, the like shaft of the bone. That point is where we're going to find what is called the epiphyseal plate in a growing person and the epiphyseal line in an adult. And so for me, if you were to look at my bone, you would see that there is basically a line right here that for you guys is a place where bones are growing, developing, and adding to their lengthwise. And so this is why like the long bones tend to hurt the most during puberty. It's because they're the ones that are growing the most, and they tend to hurt near the joints because the joints are where the head meets up with the diaphysis. Therefore, that's the point where most of our growth of the bone is going to be happening, or at least of the long bone. Now, coating around the entire bone, what we'll have is this like membrane. Basically, it's how muscles will attach down. It's called the periosteum. And there will be some level of growth, repair. Basically, it is a wrapping to protect, but also to allow for nutrients and muscles to attach with a lot of surface area for the bone in general. So periosteum, just a layer that goes around a long bone, allows us to attach some muscles down to it. Then what we're going to see is at the actual ends of the bones, this isn't part of the bone, but it'll sit on the top of both of the heads, so of the proximal head and of the distal head. What we'll see is this thing called articular cartilage. This articular cartilage, when I hear articular, I think to articulate. Basically, it means like smooth. articulation is to move, and so articular cartilage is what allows for smooth movement at joints. Basically, it is that like more rubbery, more flexible tissue of cartilage at the tops of the bones, basically to make sure that as the two bones that are meeting at that joint move, they don't rub directly on each other, which reduces the amount of friction, which then reduces the amount of inflammation that comes from the movement of those two bones on one another. And so articular cartilage you're going to find at any of our joint cavities, and it's just there to reduce the amount of friction, as well as the amount of like rubbing that happens between two bones. That then brings us to what is actually contained within the bones. We have two types of our bone marrow, right? We've got the yellow marrow and the red. Red bone marrow you're going to find in those epiphyses, right, in that spongy bone. And that is going to be where our blood cells are actually getting created. That's why it tends to be red. While our yellow bone marrow is going to be sitting within the diaphysis, right, in this middle part, in the medullary cavity. And that is going to be a large fat storage. And so fat right here in the diaphysis, blood, or at least the blood cell makers, are going to be here in the epiphyses. All right, that is going to take us into microscopic bone. So what we are going to talk about next is going to be pretty confusing and might be really hard for you guys to understand. And so as we're going through this, please make sure to check in. Make sure if you are stuck or if any of this vocab doesn't make sense, I can talk it through with you with the models so that you can see exactly what we really mean here. Now, we are going to talk about the microscopic anatomy of bone, basically looking at compact bone specifically and figuring out what are the microscopic bits that make compact bone able to arrange and organize so that it is so compact, right? Whenever I think about bone, I think about trees, in that trees have this very distinct kind of ringing pattern, and you can count how old a tree is based on the ringing pattern. Our bones kind of have that same general pattern of like the rings, but then they almost condense together to make one large living bone, living system. That system is called an osteon, or the Haversian system, and it's basically the unit of bone. It's a way to look at compact bone and understand what's going on in this kind of system here. And so I'm going to break down the system, I'm going to talk it through, and then we're going to kind of put it all together into one big picture. And so we start with the actual living bit of bone, right? Bone is a connective tissue, meaning that it is living cells in a non-living matrix. That non-living matrix is obviously the calcium, basically the rock that makes up the bones, but the living cells are these things called osteocytes. Basically, they are just mature bone cells, and they will live in these little pockets inside of the bone. They basically live inside of the mountain, inside of the rock calcium that makes up your bones. And so the osteocytes are the living cells that exist within this non-living matrix of bone. Those osteocytes are actually going to be found inside of little pockets or little caves, right? I think about it as if the whole bone is made out of this calcium, right, it's like a rock deposit, you need to have something that's almost caved out, hollowed out, so that the living cell can sit inside of the bone. And so those little caves that are going to be found scattered throughout the bone are called lacuna. Lacuna are where the osteocytes will sit, and you will always see, right, where we see an osteocyte, if you look at these diagrams here, you will also see a lacuna, right? It's just right below. The osteocyte is sitting inside of that lacuna. So in that like microscopic image, all those little black dots that you see, right? Those are the osteocytes, and they are sitting inside a little pocket, right? You can't really see the pocket because you can't see it on a 2D image, but those little pockets where that black dot is a pocket, a caved out like pocket called a lacuna. Now, the lacuna, right, are these like little caves with an osteocyte. But if we go back here, you'll see that they're in this ring shape, right? This ring of those black dots around a middle hole, a center like canal. And so those little dots are the osteocytes, and they ring around in what is called a lamella. So I'm going to try and show this on the diagram, but it'll be easier if you talk it through with me in class, if this really makes no sense for you. But do you guys see here in this image, or in this model here, there's almost like a wedding cake right here, right? Where you can see that there's like rings, 1, 2, 3, 4. And I'm going to show you guys on the other side here, right? Do you see these rings that go around this like red blood vessel, right? So red blood vessel in the middle, but then little tiers, little rings that go around. And you'll see on one of these that isn't like pulled up like that, you'll see how red dot in the middle, but then there's these rings that go around and around and around, right? This is what I mean when I say like the tree thing. These rings are called lamella. Every one of the rings is a lamella. So you might have 1, right, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all the way going into the center here. But basically, those rings are just rings of osteocytes, so rings of living cells in little lacuna caves that go around in a circle, right? And so what you'll see, and again, this will be way, way easier if I show you in class on the actual diagram. But if you see how there's these like little dots that all are going throughout, right? See these little dots here? Those are lacuna, right? With an osteocyte in them. And so if we look at this guy here, right? You have lamella, the rings, with the osteocytes of the dots sitting in those rings, right? It's like a little cul-de-sac where you have a ring of houses, right? And then osteocytes will live inside of those houses, and there will be another ring around, another ring around. You usually get like 5 to 7 of those rings in one singular osteon. And, right, see how here we have like, right, this is one red blood vessel with the cake around it. That is one osteon. Each of these large circles is an osteon. So like this right here, this is hard to do flipped upside down. This right here, right, is an osteon, right? If we look, osteon here, osteon here, osteon here, osteon here, osteon here, right? Each and every one of those circles is an osteon, right? The rings are the lamella, and inside the rings are the lacuna, the little caves that the osteocytes sit within. I'm saying all this multiple times because it is really confusing. It's hard to understand this bit. And so, again, I'm going to keep kind of being over-explanatory on this. All of this rings around a middle canal, right? That's those little red blood vessels that you see sticking through the middle of those osteons in the center of those circles. And that is called the Haversian canal. Basically, all cells need blood, right? All living cells need energy. That energy is delivered through blood. And so the Haversian canal is a way, it's almost like a central well in the middle of a town. It's a way to make sure that blood can get to the middle of each and every single osteon, each and every one of those units of compact bone, so that the whole bone can get a correct amount of blood supply. A lot of you guys asked in class, how does the bone actually get blood? Because it doesn't really make sense, right? And how does the blood leave, the blood that we're creating in the epiphyses, how does it leave the bone? Well, the answer is pretty simple. There is actually a really, really complex highway that runs through the bone that basically acts as like a well system. And all of our osteons, all of those units of bone, center around a well, center around a Haversian canal, which is how they will get all the blood as well as nerves to the bone. Right, blood vessels will come from outside of the bone. They will then connect through the periosteum into the actual compact bone. You'll see that there's these like side canals, right? Those are called Volkmann canals. And then the canals that go up, Those are our Haversian canals. So basically it is a complex like well system. That's how we feed the blood, how we feed the osteons, or specifically the osteocytes within the osteons. This takes us into the next bit here, which is explaining the matrix of bone. Basically, when we say bone is a connective tissue, it is a living cells in a non-living matrix, right? The living cells are those osteocytes that we just talked about, but the non-living matrix is the actual calcium, the rock deposit. That's the actual like white that you see of bones. That's the calcium. And so whenever we're talking about like the osteon, right? Well, the osteon is just rings of calcium, lamella. Those lamella are made out of calcium matrix, right, with little pockets hollowed out. Those pockets hollowed out are called the lacuna, and inside those lacuna are osteocytes sitting in there. And so the matrix is basically the mountain that has to get carved to actually be able to create this overall system to allow those living cells to live in it. And the living cells actually help to maintain the mountain. They basically will add calcium or remove calcium, basically tearing the matrix away based on how they need. And then this leads into kind of an idea, which is if we have these lamella, right? If we are organized in a way where we are centered Haversian canal, right? And then you have multiple lamella, well, we have a problem here. If I am one of the further lamella, if I'm this guy, how do I get the blood? If it's in this center, like Haversian canal, right? If the well is in the center of the town, but I'm stuck at the outskirts of the town, well, it sounds like I am not going to get nutrients. And that would be true if not for, do you guys see how right here we have these little dots, right? Those are the osteocytes. But if we look a little bit closer, do you guys see how there's these little cracks that go between the dots, right? There's little cracks that go from like here to here, all the way through. And they connect one lamella to the next. Those are called canaliculi. And all that they do is they allow for blood to be diffused from the Haversian canal through the lamella, right? And if we feed this osteocyte enough blood, the blood continues moving through those canaliculi into all of the lamella. Canaliculi are basically just the little roads that connect and allow for the exchange of nutrients from the Haversian canal to the outer lamella and to those outer osteocytes. So this is basically a connector. And now we're going to connect a couple words. I'm going to try and kind of put this into one big definition or understanding. And so for connecting the words canaliculi, lacuna, osteocyte, right? Osteocytes sit in lacuna, which are connected to one another by canaliculi. I'll say that again, right? Osteocytes sit or live in the lacuna, right? That little pocket. And those little pockets, those little caves, the lacuna, are connected to one another via the canaliculi. Canaliculi connect lacuna, which in turn connects osteocytes. Right, the next couple words we want to try and connect here are lamella, bone matrix, and Haversian canal. For these three, Haversian canal is in the middle. Lamella ring around the Haversian canal and are made out of bone matrix. So lamella are just rings of calcium. Lamella are rings of bone matrix that ring around the Haversian canal. Each and every one of those rings around the canal is a lamella. And they are made out of bone matrix primarily, but in those lamella you'll have little carved out lacuna with an osteocyte sitting inside of them. And the last one here is just connecting these terms osteon and blood vessel. Osteons run around a blood vessel, right? Blood vessels feed the osteon through the Haversian canal. You can't have any living cells without blood, without some kind of blood support. And so blood vessels have to actually go through each and every one of the osteons to make sure that they're properly nourished and fed. Okay, last bit here is going to be a little bit of a kind of look ahead. This is going to be less focused on in this specific standard, but as we go into standards 4 and 5, which are going to be focused much more on the actual bones, names, and the markings that are found on the bones, we're going to talk about some overview stuff about bone markings and what you'll see on bones. When we're talking about long bones specifically, what we're going to see a lot is these things called bone markings. And bone markings are basically things that stick up or stick down on a bone. The way I think of it is like landmarks on a bone. Basically, if I was sightseeing on this bone, what would I expect to see? What is different than the rest of the bone? And why do we have those landmarks? It tends to be that a lot of these are either for muscle attachment or to allow one thing to slot into another thing. And it's really just important for us to have an idea on these kind of bone markings before we get into the actual naming of the bones, where it might get a little bit more complex and where we'll have a lot more vocab terms. And so the first bit is we have kind of overview of bone markings. You have bone markings that can stick up or indent in. And the ones that stick up are called projections. They're just raised areas, and they usually are sites of attachment for muscles, ligaments, tendons. If you guys see, right, on this bone, do you see how these two like knobs here, right? That is a projection. If you guys see here how there's this bit that like sticks off the side, projections, just anything that sticks off of a bone. And that goes kind of inverse to depressions, which are any indented area or hole that allows for things to move through or to slot into it. And so if we look at the same kind of bone, right, these side bits that stick off are projections. But do you guys see how there's this like piece that kind of sticks inward, right? My finger can kind of like go into this bit. This would be a depression. This is what allows for your ulna to basically lock in place on your humerus. Depressions allow for things to kind of stick in because they're indentations. Now we have a couple specific projections or specific types of projections that we want to have an idea on. And first is called a trochanter. Trochanters are the largest form of projection that we only really find on the femur. And trochanters are just large muscle attachment sites. So if you guys can see, it's not the head, but it's this bit right here, right? This is our greater trochanter. And then this bit right here is the lesser trochanter. And so these are just sites where muscles will grab onto. And trochanters are really large because the muscles that are going to grab onto the femur are going to be some of our largest muscles because they're holding our body up. So trochanters, large muscle attachment site. Tubercles are slightly smaller, but also still just a rounded bump. And so this right here is the greater and lesser tubercle. Again, muscle attachment site. Anytime I see like a word that starts with a T like this, a tuberosity, a tubercle, a trochanter, all of those tell me it is a muscle attachment site. I think of it as like the rule of T. If you have any like second word, like the gluteal tuberosity, the lesser trochanter, the greater trochanter, that T word probably just means muscle attachment site. We also have what are called processes. A process is a part that sticks off, so it is a type of projection. Again, muscle or attachment site, as well as some joint formations. The spine, we actually have multiple different processes, right? We have our transverse on the side. We have our spinous process, which is like the back part that you feel when you kind of run your hand on your spine. But again, just allow for things to jigsaw in together and allow for muscles to attach. The head of a bone is going to be the part that slots into another bone or forms a joint. And so we usually have like I was saying earlier, a proximal head and a distal head. But basically, it's the part of a long bone that allows it to interact with another long bone. And the head is usually going to be part of the epiphysis. We also have what is called a foramen. There are not going to be any foramens usually on like a long bone. We tend to see these on things like flat bones, irregular bones. Basically, a foramen is a hole where things can pass through. The hole that allows your brain to connect to your spinal cord and move through your skull, the one that we are seeing in this diagram, that's called the foramen magnum. It's basically the largest foramen, the largest hole that things run through. Okay, and then the last one here is just going to be what is called a fossa. Basically, fossa are just a depression that allows for another bone to slot in to that depression. And so on our arms, we have two of these. We have the olecranon fossa and the coronoid fossa. And they're just where your ulna and radius will basically lock in place and then get stuck so that they can't overextend. That is the bone markings. Again, for the bone markings, you're not going to be asked to really know all of these, but you will see later on in this standard and in this unit as a whole, you will see a lot more of these kind of bone marking terms. And I want to make sure you guys at least had a bit of an idea on those before we get into the really heavy memorization piece. That is it for what I have for you today. Let me know if you have any questions. Again, I know that the osteon bit was really, really confusing. So if you need that whole part kind of re-explained, just let me know and I can kind of talk you through it. But have an amazing rest of your day, and I will see you all in the next one.